everybody. My name is Stanton Wong. Today I'm going to do a presentation on measuring performance, and it's going to be a general introduction to reset and also to reset air. This presentation, we're going to touch on 5 topics. We're going to go into trends a bit, and then a general introduction to reset. We're going to touch on reset air, go through a bunch of case studies, and then also introduce the rest of the reset standards as well. So we'll start off with trends. This is important right now because we're actually seeing a lot of policymakers looking into data and also performance for buildings. And so this is becoming more and more of a topic. One of the larger trends that we've been seeing, CSRD is a new reporting requirement for carbon, and it's been implemented in the EU. A lot of companies are larger than 500 employees, I believe, are now required to report Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 for carbon. And this is just to start. They've been pushing for this since 2021, and this is going to, by 2026, every single company is required to implement some kind of carbon reporting. In New York City, we're seeing a lot more requirements around continuous monitoring for energy. So there's local law 97 now requires carbon emissions cap for buildings over 25,000 square feet. This is going to be a large percent of buildings that are currently not within the limits. And so there's going to be a lot of improvements needed, and buildings are going to be ranked like this with a building of energy efficiency rating, determining how efficient they are in terms of energy. So, and in Maryland, there's the Climate Solutions Now Act, where there's a request or requirement to reduce emissions by 60% by 2031 and net zero emissions by 2045. So I'm highlighting this generally just to state that there's a trend towards monitoring data, et cetera, and this ties very strongly into what reset does and also how reset air is conceptually thought of. So reset is a standard for buildings. We like to call ourselves a performance standard, and the reason is because we focus a lot on data. One of the questions we asked ourselves a lot in the beginning was, how do we make the built environment more sustainable and healthy with the lowest cost and effort? And the answer we always came to was starting with data collection and continuous monitoring. Some of the benefits of data collection first is, from an operational perspective, you start to better understand your building. From a history perspective, you now have legacy information, how your building operates across the different years, across different seasons. And at any point where you want to upgrade the building, it's easier to create actionable plans and optimal solutions from a cost perspective as well, to target specifically what the issues are, because you have data to back up exactly what, to back up and understand exactly what's going on. And lastly, for facilities teams, training to understand how to leverage this data is very important. At Reset, we strongly believe you cannot effectively solve what you cannot measure. And so what we do at Reset is to promote data collection and continuous monitoring via a standardization. The reason why standardization is so important for this is because if you can standardize data, then you make it more comparable, which means that all this data becomes much more benchmarkable. So what is Reset? Reset is a set of standards. So these are offered out for free, and it helps buildings understand how to monitor their buildings. Something that we do that's different from a lot of other standards is that we're completely non-prescriptive in regards to solutions. We focus on how to collect the best quality data for whichever standard or category that we're looking at. A quick comparison to traditional standards. LEED, WELL, FitWell, a lot of these are more generalist design standards. What I mean by that is they are more qualitative. There's a very powerful checklist that helps you understand what needs to be implemented in your building. But a lot of the data that's collected is a point in time. And the result is something that is not necessarily usable for reporting. So you get plaques, silver, gold, platinum, etc. But there's no specific data points for exactly how much energy you're using or exactly what your air quality is. It's more of making sure that you have these solutions in place for the building to operate in a more sustainable or healthy way. We kind of flip this. We don't care exactly what you put into your building. We focus on measuring the data, so being quantitative and real time. And the goal is to make sure that we collect high quality data. The data is transparent, so you can follow the chain of custody to see where it came from. And at the end of the day, with standardization, benchmarkable. So just to kind of build on the story a little bit more, on paper metrics and operational metrics are not the same. What I mean by this is on paper metrics for most MEP systems, they're extremely relevant at the beginning of their life, as in when the systems are new, because you don't have to consider how they operate after facilities teams have been using them for 3 to 6 years, for example. Operational metrics is measuring with sensors to understand exactly how these MEP systems are working at the time. And the big difference between the two is over time, systems will have wear and tear. They will start operating less and less optimally. And without sensors detecting what's going on, it's going to be very hard to maintain or to understand exactly how your building is operating. So having sensors is going to be much more productive in the long term than just leveraging the data on your spec sheets. And so our kind of general gist is we're looking at thinking performance first and always data first for all buildings and for all things that we're looking at. So the complete set of standards includes 2 sections. We have an embodied standard and an operating standard. And embodied I'll touch upon at the very end. For operating, we have air, water, energy, and waste. So all of these require continuous monitoring. So the idea is that if you're collecting data, you cannot have humans manually logging this data. Otherwise, you're going to start losing large amounts of data because it's hard to maintain the consistency of collecting manual data over time. Today's focus is going to be on air quality, so we will dive deeper into air. The concept of reset air was to see the invisible. The history of this was we have a large research team in Shanghai, and we lived, we were here at the time when a documentary came out talking about outside air quality. And the specific headline was the air you saw outside, the fog, specifically the fog that you saw outside was not fog, but air pollution. It's a more interesting title in Chinese because the term fog and air pollution is off by 1 character. So air pollution is essentially dirty fog. That's how you would translate it. And the the idea behind recent air was if the air outside was bad, and how bad was the air inside in indoor spaces? We are a company that initially looked at materials, so we had a big understanding of how materials off gas, CO2 issues from lack of fresh air. Now we have an additional factor of outside air potentially coming into the inside environment. So we believe that indoor air quality was going to be much worse than outdoor air quality, but there was no way to prove it. You couldn't see the fog in indoor environments. So what we came out with was there has to be a way to see this pollution. And the only way we thought was possible to see this was to have sensors that were continuously monitoring the air and seeing whether or not PM 2.5, TVOC, or CO2 have reached a peak that it shouldn't normally be reaching. Just to highlight why we've chosen these couple of parameters, PM 2.5 is a reflection of outdoor air quality. TVOC is a reflection of chemical off-gassing, so anything that if you're using materials that potentially have chemicals in it, for example, formaldehyde or benzene, there is potential of off-gassing. And so we want to make sure we catch that. And CO2 is a proxy for ventilation. So this is not something that is determined to be always harmful to the body, but once it reaches a certain number, so Above 1000 ppm is when we start talking about effective performance, but over 3 or 5000 ppm, that's when we're starting to look at potential health matters. And these three parameters give you a general overview of understanding what the indoor air quality is. There are a lot of other parameters that we can look into, but these are the three core that we believe are absolutely critical. With most projects previously, this is the kind of idea behind what happens. So during construction phase, there's always going to be a lot of air pollution in the indoor space. And before occupancy, there's always a flush out phase. For all traditional standards, if there is an air quality component, there is a one point in time test. And if if you're a consultant working on this, you will never test during the construction phase or during the occupancy phase. You're going to have to test when you have full control of the building during the flush out phase. So this is where you're going to get the air quality measurements, but it doesn't help you understand exactly how the space will perform when there's occupancy. So that's why continuous monitoring over longer periods of time is important, and spot tests are not good enough for most indoor spaces. A comparison that you can think about for this is DSLR cameras versus CCTV cameras. DSLR cameras are very, they give you a lot of, what is it called? They give you a lot of pixels in the sense that they give you a lot of data for that one point in time shot, but it gives you nothing in terms of information over time. While CCTV, often much blurrier, it gives you an understanding of how the space is operating or what's happening in the space over time. So with air quality sensors, the ones that we're requiring for reset, you're essentially installing CCTV cameras for air quality. So as a standard, what we do is we're targeting the goal of collecting data that is trusted, actionable, and relevant. And to do this, we look at three different things. One is the monitor specification. This includes the quality of the data that's being collected in the monitors. The way that we test them is we require you to put 5 monitors in an office space, run the data for 3 weeks, and make sure that the 5 units are performing similar to the trend of a reference monitor, and then the 5 of them are consistent with relative accuracy. So if you bought 10 of the same monitors, you should expect all of them to perform the same way. Along with specification, we also care about deployment. So the rules that are established in the Reset Air standard focus around where do you put these monitors to get the highest quality data and the largest range of capturing where occupants are staying in spaces. The second part is installation and calibration requirements. So we consider where you need to, how you install it to get the, again, highest quality data, and whether you need to consider calibration for these monitors. And lastly, data reporting and platform requirements. So Reset is unique in the sense that you are required to submit data live, either every 30 minutes or every 24 hours to a online auditing cloud. And this cloud essentially is checking all the data and running analytics to make sure that you're passing the target requirements for Reset. So this is something unique. Data is live. We're auditing data also continuously. Just to highlight how the data is connected when you push data to the Reset cloud. So in every building, if you're doing Reset, you need the physical hardware installed in the building for measuring. So in terms of air quality, you're installing air quality monitors. At the second layer, there's data providers. So all monitors are going to be connected to some business cloud or software cloud where you're adding in the daily operations business logic. What this means is maybe graphs for looking for facilities managers. It might be live data, notifications, or automation. All of this will exist in this layer. And the data provider is responsible for summarizing the data and then sending it to the Reset cloud either every 30 minutes or every 24 hours. Reset specifically does not offer data provider services nor build any monitors because from our perspective, this would be a conflict of interest. We focus purely on being third-party verification. And so data providers and monitors are ones that partner with us to either get certified or connected with us to be able to provide summary data. So more details on specifically how reset error works. Reset error can be applied to two different project typologies. On the right, we have commercial interiors, and on the left, we have core and shell. So commercial interiors on the right specifically focuses on the air being breathed by the tenants. So the rules for how you install and everything is focused on installing at the breathing zone, which is kind of the height between where you sit and stand. We set it as 3 feet to 6 feet approximately. That's the height at which you should install air quality monitors. For core and shell, this is air being delivered by the building. So this goes into the air ducts. We have a monitor pre-filtration, so measuring essentially outdoor air quality, and then post-filtration to measure air quality that's been filtered or cleaned up right before it's being delivered. This gives you a comparison of whether or not your system is working if the outdoor air pollution is bad. The reason why we separated interiors and core and shell is because these two spaces or environments are owned by two different responsible parties. So for the interiors, typically this is going to be the tenant, and the core and shell is going to be the landlord. And for example, the tenant doesn't really have much control over the central HVAC systems, and the landlord doesn't have much control over individual tenant spaces. So having these separate and monitored separately means that you can take care of your own responsibility and also have data to back up any declarations that you might have in terms of you're offering good air quality or if you're having air quality issues. One of one of the first projects that leveraged the core and shell standard, and actually the one who helped us develop it, was Tishman Speyer. They specifically reached out to us for the core and shell standard because they were having issues with tenants that were complaining about air quality. They didn't have any data at the time to determine or to state that their air quality, the one that they're delivering to their tenants, are good. So what we helped them do was design monitors that were essentially installed into the ducts to measure air being delivered. And with that data and with third-party verification that this is legitimate data, they were able to show that their system was running optimally and the air quality issue was actually in the tenant space. So the conversation, instead of being a blame game, turned into a conversation around how can we solve the tenant's issue and work from there instead of complaining who was responsible for the bad air quality. So now we're going to go into a couple case studies. Most of these are earlier on case studies from projects that we personally worked on when we were still testing out Reset Air as a certification. So you'll notice that a lot of these are more in the Asia region. The first case study I want to share is Heinz. This is a building in Shanghai. It's noteworthy that this was a new build and that they actually had a large budget to put to air quality. So what they did was on every single floor, they installed in-duct monitors for core and shell, and they didn't only install in the air being delivered, they added additional monitors for air, return air. And the fun thing with this was because it was a new build, there were a lot of new tenants moving into the building every week. And the new tenants obviously needed to do renovations to the space, but the rules here were that you could only do renovations during off hours. So when it's working hours, you're not allowed to do any kind of renovation. Because of the monitors they installed, they could always detect right away if a renovation was happening if they saw PM 2.5 or VOCs go up in any floor. And so if they ever saw that, security would be sent to the floor. They would look around and see if anything's happening. They almost always caught one or two guys trying to catch up on work. And they were able to immediately request them to leave. And then for the floors that were affected by the air quality, they sent out an email letting the office managers know. And so it became a thing where they were or they were very responsive, number one, and they became um, the opposite of passive in terms of figuring out what these issues are. They were very proactive in telling their tenants what the issues were and resolved it before the tenants could even complain. Tishman Speyer, this was the one I mentioned earlier. They're the ones who helped us come up with the core and shell standard to alleviate the issues that they were having with air quality with their tenants. Carry Properties, they're a Hong Kong developer. They have buildings across China and in Hong Kong. They were one of the first ones to reach out to us to say, we want all our business towers to have really good air quality. And this was a top-down requirement. And so the facilities teams had no idea how to do this. All they knew was that they had a new KPI, and that was around air quality. The interesting thing for this one was because the KPIs were set so clearly, these facilities teams were like they reached out to us every week to figure out how can they optimize better. What should they be investing in for air quality systems to resolve these issues? And it was because their bonuses were directly tied to these air quality metrics. And so uh, having very clear numbers as a requirement makes it so that facilities teams have very clear direction for what they need to achieve in terms of their KPI. Just one more thing to mention for these specific, for Carry Properties, it took them approximately 6 to 9 months for most of their buildings to get to a point where they were achieving high quality air across the board. So just to mention that for facilities teams, sometimes it takes a bit of time and it takes a little bit of investment if you have any air quality issues. Starbucks Reserve, this is a I think the largest Starbucks in China. 2 floors, and on the right side of the image that's not being shown, there's a roastery. So they're roasting and packaging beans right there in the space. Roasting creates PM2.5, and so they were very clear that, and there's no glass partition, it's not separating the space. They needed to make sure that whatever filtration they had in place maintained PM2.5 levels under a certain threshold. And so they used the reset standard to establish the requirements for their vendors, for the air quality vendors, to hit certain targets for CO2 levels and hit certain targets for PM2.5. And they essentially measure their vendors on the success based on these numbers. They were able to perform very well. This space gets over 8,000 customers a day. They maintain CO2 levels under 800 ppm on average. And for PM2.5 levels, they maintained it under 35, which is not a very ambitious target, but for a space that was roasting beans, this was very good. Cordis is a hotel. They applied Reset Air from a hospitality perspective, where sleeping in a space with good air quality will it will improve your sleep. And there is scientific research backing this. So this was integrated into the marketing materials. They had monitors installed in every single room. They created an app that existed on their TVs where you could open the app and see exactly what the air quality was like in your room, and you can see the air quality monitor in your room as well. We've seen hotels where they have a display of air quality, but you can never find the monitor in the room. So it was nice to see that they actually had a little sign pointing to the monitor and stating that we're monitoring your room and making sure that you have good air quality. The fun highlight that's not really written is that it became extremely easy for this hotel to find out whether or not someone was smoking in the room, because it would immediately highlight with PM2.5 levels that the room was completely over any normal number. So it goes up to 300 ppm, micrograms per meter cubed easily when you're smoking in a room. And so if it was a non-smoking room, they could immediately tell them to stop. And the last case study I'll mention is um, is fixing of air quality issues in a poorly commissioned building. So this is it's a building in a university, Tsinghua University to be specific, and it's funded by Steven Schwarzman of Blackstone. This building, when it was first finished, there were a lot of issues with air quality, with smells and everything. And so a company was brought in to resolve the issue, and their suggestion was instead of just trying to figure out right away what the issues are, we are going to install monitors in your space, run it for 2 weeks to a month, and then figure out where specifically are the issues. Is it certain rooms? Is it the entire space? Is it a PM 2.5 issue or a TVOC issue or a CO2 issue? So the idea was we need to look specifically at what the issues are to target these issues with our solutions, minimizing costs, etc. So that was their approach. They looked at 1 month of data. They spent 1 month resolving the issues, and then on the third month, the data became excellent. And then some other things for in terms of consideration for what you can do with this data. Um, COVID has been a large part of our lives in the past couple of years. We were interested in looking at whether or not the parameters that we're measuring, PM2.5, VOCs, CO2, temperature, and relative humidity, could be leveraged to understand how optimized the building was to prevent airborne viral transmission. So COVID, we now know, happens through the air. And back in 2000, when COVID first became a thing, we started doing research on this. And a year later, we came out with a paper for the recent viral index. So the highlight for this is essentially that CO2 and relative humidity are the two parameters that are most tied to airborne viral transmission. CO2 specifically for how much fresh air is in the space. So the way to optimize this is to consider if there's no one in the building and CO2 levels are very low, it is highly unlikely that you'll catch airborne viral transmission because it's just so diluted. But if CO2 is very high, that means there's a lot of people in the building. And if we assume 1 or 2 people might have COVID, then with high levels of CO2, you expect more viral particles in the air. And so at that point, your building is less optimized for making sure that you don't have any viruses, or there's less likelihood of airborne viral transmission. The second part is relative humidity, which affects how long these particles can exist in the air. So there's an optimal level of relative humidity, which is actually the same as what we find most comfortable. So between 40 and 60 is the most comfortable. You want to maintain humidity around that to minimize the amount of time that particles can stay in the air. So just highlighting that you can leverage this data for things like a building optimization viral index to measure and look into whether or not a building has been designed or operated to minimize airborne viral transmission. For data, again, I just want to bring us back to why data is important and what our standard is really doing. We look at data in 3 different ways. One is the completeness of data. So this is the idea of we don't want to look at data from, we don't want to record data manually. We want to make sure that it's automated. So that's why we use monitors, because that's the only way you can have a complete set of data. Quality looks into the quality of the data that's collected from the monitors, and then where you've located them to get the highest quality, most relevant data for a specific space. And performance is essentially just what the data says. The goal, again, is to make sure that whatever data we collect is trusted, actionable, and relevant, because a lot of times it's not about what you do with the, it's not about just collecting data, it's what you do with the data afterwards. So we've gone deep into air. I am going to really quickly touch upon the other standards to end this presentation. Water is a focus on conservation awareness. So I think most of us don't see how much water is being used. So with Reset Water, we're looking at measuring total water consumption and production if there is any. So if there's any kind of rainwater capture, etc., we want to measure how much water is being consumed and produced for the space. One other use case is water quality. So we've discovered that actually in the market, there are very few water quality sensors that are IoT connected, but there are starting to be a few. With water quality, there are certain, so municipal water treatment plants. Obviously, it would be interesting to have water quality data streamed from there. What we've seen is water quality for drinking water. In Asia, tap water is not drinkable, and so there's filtration systems that are implemented to essentially filter water, and um, detecting the water quality in that and making it live is a strong way to highlight for users that this is drinkable water. You don't have to buy bottled water. You can save water that way. Sorry, save plastic that way. With Reset Energy, again, it's continuous monitoring. The goal is to measure total energy consumption and production as a baseline, and also to do subset energy, essentially sub-metering, to break down into HVAC, lighting, etc. And the goal of this is to make sure that it's comparable, but also if a building or a space ever wants to declare that they're net zero, um, having third-party verified consumption and production data makes it so that their argument for net zero is much stronger. For for total net zero energy, the only spaces that we've seen that this is possible for is um, lower like lower level in terms of floors, but really wide breadth. So logistics centers that tend to only consume energy for lighting, those are very strong candidates for net zero. And waste transparency is an interesting one because I think most of waste programs are only looking at, they're doing spot tests of looking at on a specific day what kind of waste is generated, and they do a audit of that waste and then do a percentage and kind of look at the data and assume that that's going to be the type of waste that's occurring every day, and use it for the rest of the year. Our goal is to measure with IoT scales how much how much waste is created in terms of weight. And so having live data to measure this allows you to start seeing trends in how much waste is produced. And if you have any programs that are looking to minimize waste in any way, or to increase recyclables, decrease dry waste or wet waste, etc., you can have data to support it. And holistically, what we're trying to do is with this data in the same format for how you collect the data, we're looking for opportunities to compare the data against each other because they're all interconnected. One of the most obvious ones is air quality and energy. With air quality and energy, the reason why they're separately, like if they're separate, it's actually very easy to solve for them. Air quality, you have the right filters, you have enough fresh air, you're good to go. But if you're trying to do this at the most optimal levels to make sure that you're minimizing energy usage, there's an opportunity to measure both and optimize either through automation, AI systems to learn about how this building operates, or just simply have CO2 sensors that help you understand how many people are possibly in the building and just bring enough fresh air to maintain CO2 levels under a certain threshold. The last one that's slightly interesting, that's becoming a topic uh, in certain, especially around scope 3 for carbon, is looking at the embodied materials of a building. So what we look at instead of just looking at carbon is also circularity and health. And it's because these are all interconnected. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I'm going to show one picture that will help highlight exactly what we're trying to do here. Right now in the market, this is what we normally see when we're comparing two materials for like whether or not they're healthy or low carbon. We get a bunch of labels. but you don't get the data behind the labels. There's no numbers to compare. So you're just counting labels. These labels are what certifications like LEED and WELL require. Um, but it's hard to, without data, like without software to help parse this data, it's very hard to do much more than leveraging these labels to do an estimation of whether or not building products that are healthy and sustainable are being leveraged in a building. What we do with Reset Embody is we look into the specific data in each of these labels and we convert it into a number. So in this case, it's much more easily comparable and much more relevant if you're trying to get lower carbon or higher circularity, better health. These numbers become much more applicable. And for most of these, we're not creating new labels. We're just looking at what is already available and making sure that the data inside can be referenced and used in a comparable method. And for projects, the way this works is we have to get the data for each individual product. So this is a lot harder for interiors and core and show because there's a lot more products used in interiors. We take that and we essentially add it up to create a score for projects. With that said, I'm just circling back into what's happening in Maryland right now. And Climate Solutions Act is looking at reducing emissions by 60%, net zero by 2045. These are very ambitious targets, and you have to look at, I think we have to look at these holistically. And if we're talking about recent air or just air quality as well, we have to take that into consideration where we're balancing sustainability with health. Because if we're looking purely at sustainability, you can just turn off all air quality systems. You don't have to worry about health. That's the best way to lower energy consumption. But when you have health as a requirement as well, then there's a lot more systems that you have to consider in terms of automation, maybe AI. But having a performance first and a data first mindset to collect this data and to leverage the data is going to be, I think, a very important method of reaching these targets in 2031 and 2045. So with that said, thank you very much. If there are any questions, please email us or find me on LinkedIn. Um, my name is relatively easy to find. So with that said, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aaron, for having me.
Yes, Stanton, great job. Great job. Do have a few follow-up questions. When it comes to radon, how is Reset thinking about radon gas?
So we're starting to create a method to submit that data as well for verification. We haven't set a standard target for we haven't set a target for in our standard. We're likely to leverage other targets that are already set as a reference. And this is not going to be a hard requirement, but we are going to highlight a project that is measuring radon on top of the other ones, so that transparently we can highlight that these projects are going above and beyond.
Got it. Got it. Wow. So learned a lot from this presentation. Coffee roasting creates PM 2.5. Wasn't aware of that.
Almost every kind of roasting creates PM 2.5. And so one of the things I learned that was kind of sad for me, because I'm from Vancouver, close to Whistler, was that anytime you're burning wood in an indoor space, there's going to be a lot of PM 2.5, even if you have a chimney. So unfortunately, we've never thought about that. But also previously, buildings that were burning wood or spaces that were burning wood, they were very leaky, as in a lot of air would come in and out. And so PM2.5 wouldn't get stuck in indoor environments. But as we build buildings with better building envelopes and more airtight, we actually really have to consider monitoring PM2.5 because a lot of practices that we do at home, even candles and stuff, can create PM2.5.
That's right. That's right. Just a few other questions here. So the Reset Viral Index, any plans for it to measure maybe asthma triggers?
We haven't done research on that yet. We would be interested in doing it. It just comes down to bandwidth, and also we, if there is an opportunity to work with universities or students on that research, we would gladly basically partner with them to figure this out.
Got it. Got it. So what would you say is the maybe the biggest barrier to adoption? I know that we, as you know, we're working in an industry that's the least digitized, declining in productivity, and has a high resistance or reluctance to change. But what would you say
Yeah.
is probably the number one barrier for building owners and occupants to embrace reset?
When we first started, the hardest part was implementing or getting local service for monitoring hardware and also data provider services. So number one, that was you just didn't have monitors, so you couldn't do any kind of measuring. And then after we started getting monitors and software providers, the next issue was there was very little experience in resolving air quality issues. So if you collect all the data and you know the data, like the data shows that it's bad, and you don't have a team locally that can come in, troubleshoot, and solve your issues, you're stuck at stuck at stage one again. And one of the first clients that we had were actually schools. Um, and schools are interesting because parents really care about the kids' health if you make this data available. And so the schools that we worked with, they actually had to take down these monitors because parents were so sensitive with the data that if PM2.5 went above the threshold for, let's say, 30 minutes, some parent will see it and then they'll call the school and ask what the hell is going on, which is a pain in the butt for the school, even though they're doing really well in all circumstances. Because, for example, sometimes the PM2.5 going up in indoor environments is because the outdoor air is really bad, and they're already controlling indoor air as much as possible. So that was hard, but generally, I think having the systems in place available and also the solutions available if you actually have the data. Those two are very important. And then it just comes down to awareness. I think there's a stronger push from schools right now in the US towards monitoring air quality because there's an understanding that this is important for our children's health and also their growth in general. And so this is something that should be invested in. We are I think one thing that we have to be aware of is that for most of these schools, um, I'm hearing that they're getting contracts where it's one provider across the board. For most of these schools, they have to really consider also what is the long-term kind of view of how they want to approach this. Do they always want to work with one provider, or do you want to be more hardware agnostic, data provider agnostic, where they can switch freely? And I don't think the market's quite there yet, but that's going to be something that they'll have to think about at some point.
That's very interesting. So when we're talking about schools, are you finding it's more like K through 12 or primary schools or maybe secondary schools, colleges, universities? Which do you think are adopting reset more than others?
In terms of schools, right now we know that there are a few like the schools that we worked with initially first were international schools. They had larger budgets. They had very like they had clientele that basically were slightly better off and parents that really cared about their kids' health. So that's kind of the market we initially were in because we had a larger presence in Asia. With North America, what we're hearing right now is that there's a lot of there's a lot of government contracts looking for air quality monitoring. They're not necessarily going for reset, but we're happy to see that they're at least considering continuous monitoring because this was not a conversation that was anywhere a year or two ago. The only people in North America that were looking into this were building owners that wanted to increase the the not exclusivity, but just the performance of their building from a health perspective, from a sustainability perspective. It was also a general attempt to move towards smarter buildings because we're very much aligned with the smart building concept of using sensors, which then allow you to automate. Automation allows you to have more optimal and more efficient systems where you're using less energy for better results. So all of this is interconnected, and I'm not quite sure exactly how the solutions are going to be implemented for schools, but starting with collecting the data and making And the other thing is making sure it's being collected in a centralized place where you can actually use the data afterwards. That's actually very critical because I think I also heard at the beginning of, or sometime last year, there were school projects where they're monitoring, but there was no solution for collecting all this data into a place that made the data easily accessible. Without the easily accessible data, the data you're collecting is almost useless because no one's going to look at it to leverage it.
Got it. Got it. Thank you so much, Stanton. This has been very informative. Definitely appreciate your time and your subject matter expertise and thought leadership on the topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, Aaron.
All right. Thank you.